courtroom was never meant to hold this much energy. Every chair was taken. The air buzzed with anticipation like the moment before thunder cracks the sky. Representative Jasmine Crockett had just finished her speech, not the kind you politely clap for and forget 5 minutes later, but the kind that rearranges the way people think. She stood at the podium like a conductor finishing the last note of a symphony. Her words weren't just policy, they were fire, logic, and rebellion wrapped in conviction. But before the applause could die down, a familiar voice rose from the front row. Maxine Waters, a legend, a veteran, a titan, slowly stood up, setting her notes aside. That was the moment the courtroom changed forever. See, what just happened wasn't ordinary. What? Maxine Waters had abandoned her scripted speech. Why? Because Jasmine Crockett's vision had shaken something deep inside her, the kind of rare spark politicians forget they once had. Who? Waters, the queen of congressional grit. How? By speaking directly, raw, and unscripted. When, at the peak of a national conference meant for bureaucratic niceties. Where the National Urban Policy Conference now turned into the most electric arena in modern political memory. Waters began with a sentence that cut through the noise like lightning. "I came here to speak, but now I must respond." The room froze. Crockett looked up, her eyes widened just enough to betray both surprise and reverence. Everyone knew what this meant. When Maxine Waters speaks off script, history listens. Crockett's proposal had already set the stage. It wasn't a speech about repairing what's broken, it was about building what already works. She rejected the tired deficit lens that treated communities as problems to be fixed. Instead, she painted a future built on existing strengths, small businesses, local networks, and community institutions that held neighborhoods together even when governments forgot them. It was a blueprint that sounded less like politics and more like rebirth. Waters, watching from the front, had seen 1,000 speeches. Most vanished the next day. But this one burned. She stood, adjusting her glasses, and with the measured calm of a woman who'd seen both riots and reform, she said, "Congresswoman Crockett, your vision brilliantly balances pragmatic solutions with moral clarity and courageous imagination." The room exhaled slowly, collectively, because they realized what was happening, a passing of the torch. But before we go further, let's rewind the tension. See, for weeks, political circles whispered that Waters might criticize Crockett. Rumors swirled that the veteran congresswoman saw her as too idealistic, too bold, too fast. But here she was standing in full public view, not to correct, but to endorse. That shock alone sent a ripple through the conference hall so strong you could feel the pulse through the floor. Crockett herself wasn't born from privilege or political dynasties. She was an economic development attorney who learned early that the system doesn't fix itself, you either outthink it or it eats you alive. Her policy wasn't theory, it was survival with a plan. She wanted to strengthen the pillars that already held communities up: local businesses, churches, co-ops, neighborhood schools. That's where the economy lived, not in Wall Street skyscrapers, but in the grit of corner stores and after-school programs. Waters nodded as Crockett spoke earlier, but now she leaned forward, her hand gripping the podium edge. "For 50 years, she said, I've fought for economic justice, but I've rarely seen someone reimagine it with such fearless clarity." The audience didn't clap yet. They were too stunned to interrupt. The tension was thick, like the moment before a verdict is read. What? A legend endorsing a rising star. Why? Because Crockett's plan offered evolution, not rebellion, continuity, not chaos. Who? Maxine Waters, using her authority not to dominate but to amplify. How? By vowing to use her remaining time in Congress to advance this vision. When right there live on national broadcast, where, at a conference, suddenly turned into an impromptu generational alliance. Then came the release, the applause, not the polite, rhythmic kind politicians collect like coins. This was a roar, a standing, soul-deep ovation that felt like the entire room just remembered why politics mattered. Cameras flashed, pens dropped, and one journalist whispered, "This isn't a conference anymore, it's a coronation." Waters continued, her tone shifting from praise to promise. "I will dedicate the time I have left in this chamber," she said, "to making sure this vision doesn't fade like another headline. Jasmine, you've reignited what we fought for." That line hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. But Crockett didn't bask in it. She stepped forward, meeting Waters' gaze, and replied, "Then let's fight together, not as generations divided by time, but as voices united by purpose." It wasn't rehearsed, it couldn't have been. The energy was too raw, too electric. The crowd rose again, louder this time. At that moment, something subtle yet seismic happened. The cameras didn't just capture a moment, they captured momentum. Because what followed next, nobody expected it. Within hours, clips of the exchange dominated every social feed. Hashtags like Waters Crockett Alliance and Vision for Tomorrow began trending. Even cable pundits who couldn't agree on breakfast called it the rarest form of political alchemy, respect between generations. And yet, the real storm was brewing quietly in the rooms where power listens, not where applause echoes. Behind closed doors, financial lobbyists frowned. The idea of community-based lending through CDFIs and cooperative ownership threatened the old money flow. What Crockett proposed empowering local economies to self-sustain. Why to keep wealth circulating within neighborhoods. Who banks and development corporations now felt cornered. How through new frameworks that prioritized people over profit, when immediately she had called for pilot programs within a year. Where urban hubs across the nation, from Detroit to Dallas. And that's where Maxine Waters' backing changed everything. Because when she speaks, the financial sector listens reluctantly but attentively. Her endorsement meant this wasn't some rookie's idealistic fantasy anymore, it was legislative ammunition. Crockett, knowing exactly what she'd set in motion, leaned into it. She began connecting economic opportunity with other community systems, education, healthcare, civic engagement. You can't grow a community, she declared, if the soil is poisoned by neglect. That line, poetic yet pragmatic, became the anchor quote replayed across national media for weeks. The tension now wasn't between people, it was between paradigms. The old guard's approach of fixing deficits versus Crockett's asset-based model. The release came when Waters cut in once more. We've spent decades patching holes in ships instead of teaching people to build better ones. Jasmine is here to change that. The crowd cheered like the courtroom itself had just ruled in her favor. But then came the twist, the one that turned admiration into a movement. After the conference, instead of letting the applause fade, Waters invited Crockett to co-host a series of national forums. They called it the Community Prosperity Initiative. Sounds bureaucratic, right? But behind that title was something revolutionary. The plan provided funding, technical assistance, and real implementation grants for communities ready to adopt Crockett's integrated model. Within days, local leaders began calling in. Chicago wanted in. Atlanta was already drafting proposals. Even skeptical mayors, the kind who never trust federal programs, said this one felt different. Why? Because it didn't tell communities what they lacked, it asked them what they already had. But just as the wave of excitement began to crest, a new kind of pressure emerged. Think tanks started dissecting the proposal, calling it too optimistic, financially risky, politically naive. It was the oldest move in the book, discredit through caution. That's when Waters fired back in a televised interview. If courage were safe, it wouldn't be courage. And with that one line, the narrative flipped again. Meanwhile, Crockett, ever the strategist, turned criticism into content. She began using their doubts as proof of progress. If the comfortable are nervous, she joked in one interview, we're finally doing something right. That line went viral, of course, but more importantly, it humanized her. She wasn't just a politician. She was relatable, sharp, and unafraid to laugh in the face of establishment discomfort. Her humor was her weapon, and Waters, her wisdom, was her shield. Together, they became what pundits called the Iron Bridge, linking eras of activism with modern innovation. But this was only the beginning, because what happened next, that shocked everyone. What happened next didn't just shock the courtroom, it rewrote the rules of political collaboration. Within weeks of that thunderous conference moment, Crockett and Waters transformed a standing ovation into a standing movement. The Community Prosperity Initiative wasn't just another policy blueprint buried in bureaucracy. It became a living, breathing model of what happens when legacy meets innovation head-on. What they launched a nationwide tour of economic development forums. Why? To make local communities architects of their own progress. Who? Crockett and Waters, the Iron Bridge of Change. How? By traveling city to city, town to town, turning theory into training, speeches into action. When just 2 months after the conference, refusing to let momentum cool. Where? From Baltimore's community centers to Oakland's university halls. The first forum took place in Detroit, a city that knew both the brilliance of industry and the heartbreak of its collapse. As the crowd filled the civic auditorium, Crockett stood beside Waters, no longer the student but the partner. She began, Detroit doesn't need saving, it needs unleashing. The audience erupted before she could even continue. That single line summed up her philosophy perfectly. Stop treating communities like victims and start treating them like investors in their own future. Waters followed with a grin that only decades of political battle could carve. If I were 30 years younger, she said, I'd be running behind this woman carrying her microphone. The crowd howled with laughter, the perfect release after the tension of anticipation. But humor aside, Waters' tone shifted into gravity. We've been fighting to open doors for generations. Jasmine just redesigned the house. Every sentence between them landed like a combination punch, one heavy with history, the other fast with vision. That was their magic, tension and release, wisdom and wit, reality and hope, cycling endlessly until audiences left not just inspired but armed with ideas. But soon, their alliance faced its first real test. Critics began framing the partnership as symbolic theater, a feel-good narrative with no teeth. The headlines read, "Old Lion, Young Dreamer, All Roar, No Reform." It was meant to sting, but Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned right into it. She confronted the narrative head-on. Why? Because silence would turn inspiration into doubt. Who? Crockett, fearless as ever. How? By releasing a detailed economic plan, a full legislative framework that mapped every funding stream, lending model, and policy coordination strategy. When 48 hours after the criticism hit, where broadcast live on national television, with Maxine Waters sitting beside her like a co-signer of destiny. Crockett's response was surgical. They call it symbolic because they've never seen substance delivered this fast. Her tone, calm but sharp, carried that trademark mix of intellect and attitude. Then she dropped the bombshell, "Community prosperity isn't charity, it's strategy." That line became the headline everywhere. And just like that, the critics flipped. Think tanks began cautiously endorsing parts of her plan. Even conservative economists admitted off-record that her focus on local financial ecosystems could reduce systemic dependency on federal subsidies. For once, both sides of the aisle whispered the same sentence: she might actually pull this off. But the system doesn't bend without resistance. Big lenders started lobbying hard to dilute the initiative. They argued that community-centered lending risked unpredictable defaults. That's bureaucratic code for we might lose control. Waters wasn't having it. She stormed a finance committee hearing like a general returning to battle. "You don't fear defaults," she thundered. "You fear democracy in dollars." The room went silent. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Crockett, watching from her seat, smiled because she knew what that meant. Maxine wasn't defending her, she was defending the future. Waters used her influence to shield the initiative. Why? Because the struggle wasn't about credit, it was about power. Who? The two women who turned applause into action. How? By strategically framing economic justice as national security, a language that Congress couldn't ignore. When midway through budget negotiations, where Capitol Hill in front of cameras, microphones, and history itself. Their tactic worked. Congress authorized preliminary funding for the initiative, $750 million in pilot grants. That was the how that turned dreams into spreadsheets, but the bigger why was philosophical. The plan didn't just inject money, it changed what qualified as worthy investment. For decades, big projects favored big corporations. Crockett's framework reversed the flow, prioritizing cooperatives, community lenders, and educational networks. At the signing ceremony, Waters joked, "I spent 50 years breaking ceilings. Jasmine just built a skylight." Even the president, usually allergic to sentiment, chuckled at that one. Humor again, perfectly placed, releasing the tension of the monumental. But politics is a cycle of praise and backlash. For every standing ovation, there's a shadow waiting to strike. Just as the initiative began rolling out, critics resurfaced, this time from within. A faction in Congress accused the duo of misallocating resources to politically friendly districts. It was nonsense, but in politics, nonsense sticks faster than truth. Allegations of favoritism. Why? To fracture the partnership and stall momentum. Who? A group of moderate holdouts seeking relevance. How? By leaking selective funding documents. When? 6 months after the program launch, where through a conveniently timed anonymous source in the media. The backlash was immediate. Headlines screamed, social feeds exploded. It was the first time the alliance looked vulnerable, but if anyone expected panic, they forgot who they were dealing with. Crockett's reply came not through statements but through action. She published every financial record of the initiative online, transparent, verifiable, and brutal in its honesty. "Sunlight doesn't scare the clean," she said during a press briefing. Waters backed her instantly. "I taught her everything except how to stay quiet." The room erupted in laughter, tension released, leadership restored. That moment, more than any speech, cemented their public identity. They weren't just leaders, they were mirrors of accountability. The crowd began to see them not as politician and mentor, but as symbol and movement. Soon, the ripple effect began. Cities across America started reporting measurable results. Small business growth up 14%, youth employment rates rising, community loan defaults down. One headline captured it perfectly: "From idea to income, the Crockett-Waters effect." But beyond numbers, something deeper was changing. People began to trust politics again, not because of slogans, but because of systems that worked. And then came the twist nobody foresaw. A national poll conducted a year after their partnership began revealed that 68% of Americans across all demographics felt more hopeful about solving local economic challenges through community collaboration. That was unheard of. In an era where division was the default, hope had somehow become bipartisan. What a cultural shift! Why? Because authenticity cuts deeper than ideology. Two women who didn't just talk reform, they embodied it. How? By being living proof that wisdom and innovation aren't rivals but relatives, when within a single transformative year, where, from congressional halls to corner stores. Their final act of defiance came quietly. In a joint interview when asked if they considered themselves symbols of progressive feminism, Waters laughed softly. "We're not symbols," she said, "we're builders. Symbols stand still, builders move," Crockett added, "and we're not done moving yet." The interviewer smiled, but everyone watching knew it wasn't just rhetoric. Behind the scenes, financial institutions had begun revising their lending criteria, inspired or pressured by the initiative's success. The impossible had become policy. From there, the legend solidified. Urban institutes began teaching the Crockett-Waters model. Universities developed research programs around asset-based community development. Even the IMF cited the initiative in a report titled Localized Economies: Global Impact. And yet, amid all the accolades, both women remained grounded. Waters continued mentoring new lawmakers while Crockett kept refining the initiative, adding layers of education reform, healthcare equity, and civic participation. The balance was poetic, one representing the wisdom of history, the other, the courage of the future. It wasn't just partnership, it was evolution, the living embodiment of a truth politicians often forget. Revolutions don't always come from shouting louder, sometimes they come from thinking smarter. In the end, as the camera faded on their last joint address, the narrator's voice echoed like a verdict. In an age drowning in division, two women stood on the same side of the line, one drawing from the past, one designing the future, and together they built a bridge strong enough for the next generation to cross. Pause, silence, then applause. And just like that, history recorded another courtroom where justice wasn't on trial, it was delivered.